30 sekunder.
Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
So, welcome to this seminar where we will launch the report, which is an evaluation of 60 years of development cooperation between Sweden and Ethiopia. This was the entertainment part of the seminar, and for the next 1 hour and a half we will be a little bit more serious. There will be a presentation of a report by its author, Bereket Kebede, who is here. You are very welcome. And after that there will be a panel discussion, which I will introduce a little bit later, and then questions and answers from all of you, and we will conclude by 1:30 sharp. So, this report has been quite long in the doing. It is a report covering 60 years of development cooperation, so appropriately enough we have taken some time to produce it, to work in depth, but we have also of course been interrupted by the pandemic. But now we are here, and we started this report. Of course, it was quite a different situation 4 or 5 years ago when we initiated it, but basically we didn't have any particular purpose or any particular decision to take, but we were more interested in, as this is a part of development cooperation which has been extremely important for a long period of time. We thought that it's time to take a proper look at what the effects have been and what we can learn from it, irrespective of whether that would be ready a year ago or a year from now or so. We expected that this will be relevant whenever it comes, and now it's here. So we look very much forward to listen to you, Bereket. And Bereket Kebede, who is the principal investigator, leading a team of 3 other persons and research assistants in Ethiopia. He has a background from the University of Addis Ababa, but since 1997 he's been abroad in England. He is now the professor of behavioral development economics at the University of East Anglia. So very welcome, Bereket, and we look forward to hearing about your labors and your findings here.
Thank you very much, Kim. I really appreciate this chance to discuss our report, which has now taken us, I think, more than three years. Initially, it was supposed to take only one year. By the way, the report is, the evaluation is done not only by me, but by Leif Danielsen, who is around here, and Gunnar Colling, and hopefully probably Hailu Elias probably is also following this presentation online. So it is a work by all 4 of us. But in addition to this, there are also other people who have helped the preparation of this report. So obviously EBA, particularly the staff. We are directly involved with Kim Force and Marcus Berman, so are very, very grateful to their support, even when sometimes we break deadlines that were very hard. They were very, very much accommodating. But in addition to this, the reference group, most of which are sitting at the front, have helped us by criticizing, sometimes insulting us when we make some major errors, but that has obviously contributed to the quality of the report. The staff at Addis Ababa Swedish embassy, the Swedish embassy at Addis Ababa, were very, very cooperative. When I went there in February, March 2020, we had free access to the archives, and they were excellent hosts. They were helping us in all activities, so our thanks also go to all the Swedish embassy staff in Addis Ababa. They also graciously gave us their time because we have done a lot of interviews with a lot of the staff. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and SIDA, Stockholm, the central SIDA office, have provided us with archival evidence, and obviously the large number of interviewees. We have got very, very useful information about projects in addition to the Swedish embassy staff. This includes also some government officials. And finally, the competent support of the research assistants, Paul Fenton-Villar, Atla Alemu, Tafarra Ndalo, and Yenenesh Hapte. All of these have contributed to the successful completion of this report. So these were the 4 major questions that were given to evaluate. So essentially, the first one looks at how appropriate Swedish support is in terms of providing development opportunities for Ethiopia. The second one looks at effectiveness, relevance, and so on. And the third one particularly focuses on the role of support given by the Swedish government for democracy, human rights, and gender equality. Particularly, this aspect of Swedish aid has become more and more important in the recent past. So the third question is essentially relates to the to assess how much the perspective of democracy, human rights, and gender equality was incorporated in Swedish support, even in other sectors. And finally, we're tasked to look at what lessons are learned from this 60 years experience and how this can help us for future prospects of Swedish aid to Ethiopia. Okay? We broadly divided the coverage of the report into 4 different sections. So one section looks at more strategic issues. So these are very general questions about the macroeconomic conditions in Ethiopia, but also as well as the overall aspect of aid from Sweden. So these sets of issues are treated in a chapter on strategic issues. Over these 6 years, Sweden has supported so many different projects, and definitely we cannot cover all these projects. So what we did was, we looked at 3 important clusters of Swedish aid, and we identified these clusters as the rural development cluster, the education cluster, and the democracy, human rights, and gender equality cluster. So generally, if you look at time, probably the democracy and human rights and gender equality become dominant in the latter parts, in the more recent past. The rural development and the education were dominant in the earlier parts. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any rural development or education projects now, or there weren't any democracy or human rights or gender-related projects in the earlier period. But the emphasis seems to shift towards the latter, from rural development and education. Methodologically, I don't want to enter into a detailed discussion of the different methods we have used. So generally, we can characterize the method we used as mixed method. We have used quantitative data, econometric analysis, statistical analysis, but we have used also qualitative data. We have heavily depended on the interviews, the interviewees of staff, SIDA staff, Swedish embassy staff, but not only that, participants of projects financed by Swedish aid. We have also discussed or interviewed people who know about Swedish aid, directly or indirectly. But we have also interviewed people who are government officials and have a knowledge about the historical process in Swedish aid in Ethiopia. In terms of conceptual framework, because we are covering a 60-year period and very different types of projects, we cannot have a sort of a specific type of theory of change that would explain everything we are doing. So essentially, we heavily depended on a sort of the tradition of an evaluation of complex adaptive systems. Because we are covering 6 years, and in fact 6 years in the case of Ethiopian history is almost 100 years, because so many things had happened in that period. So we start even in terms of political regimes. We start from Haile Selassie, which usually is characterized a feudal Solomonic dynasty. Then we went to a completely left regime, Mengistu Haile Mariam's regime. Then we moved to a sort of mixed kind of capitalist, socialist kind of combination during the EPRDF regime, and now we moved also to another. So within these 6 years, so many things have been happening. So because of that, emphasizing the historical context is extremely important. So in all of the interpretation, in fact, some of our interpretation, let's say about the role of old projects like CADU, has a sort of revisionist type of interpretation, because we believe the earlier interpretations did not take into account the historical context, let's say the evolution of land tenure at that time. Okay, so this is more or less the sort of the methodology we employ in the report. Now let me give you some of the highlights in the different sections. And if we look at the different highlights, if I come first with the strategic issues. Now generally, if you take Sweden as in relation to other donors, Sweden is a middle-level donor. It's not the biggest donor. It's not also the smallest donor. And usually it's ranked around 8s or 9s from the total aid that goes to Ethiopia. So it's a middle-level bilateral donor. But one of the specific characteristics of Swedish aid is it is stable. In periods, even in periods where almost all Western aid was withdrawn from Ethiopia, Sweden was there. Swedish aid was there for almost all the 60 years. So if we compare it with the other donors, the sort of the fluctuation we observe among other donors is not as much seen. Of course, there are changes also in Swedish aid, but it's more stable compared to the other donors. And we also looked at the sort of the middle power nature of Sweden. Sweden is not like a superpower like United States or USSR or Russia or China. Yeah, it's not also a very poor country like African countries. So the fact that it is a middle power country may have played an important role in defining the feature, the characteristics of aid given to Ethiopia, but most likely also to other countries. So this is another part we saw, especially when we assess the literature, is the relative independence of SIDA, the aid agency, from government policy. So there are many, in the literature, there are many studies which compare the experience of SIDA with DFID or with other aid agencies in other Western countries. And most of them emphasize the fact that SIDA is relatively more independent compared to the others. So all these have an impact on these strategic issues. One thing we observed is Sweden, even though it is a relatively small donor to Ethiopia, usually it's punching more than its weight. We observe this in two ways, especially in terms of donor coordination. Sweden plays a much active role compared, let's say, to the same level of donors to Ethiopia. And what we did was, in addition to this sort of explicit formal role Sweden plays in coordinating activities of donors, we also try to look at whether there is also an informal way of leading the other donors. So a formal way is they join, let's say, the FIDA may be chairing the development assistant group, and because of that, it plays more important role, an explicit role in leadership. But sometimes leadership can be also informal. It's not because you are the chair of a coordinating committee that you lead. Sometimes other donors may follow you because they think you are a good donor. So other donors may not do sort of due diligence. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources to do that. So the best thing to do is look at another donor which they believe is a good donor. And they look what the other donor is doing and they follow them. So leadership can also function in this informal way. And what we found, it's rather weak, but some evidence is found that Sweden seems also to lead informally. When Sweden changes something, usually other donors also follow it. So probably Sweden has a sort of trust, respect also by other donors. So in addition to the formal, coordination through development assistance groups, Sweden may have also played a role of informally leading the other donors. One characteristic feature which comes again and again when we talk people with different experiences, when we talk with the commissioner of the planning commission in the 1960s during the Haile Selassie regime, or the current, let's say, big official in the Ministry of Planning, the current, what we observe is there is a very, very strong tradition of consultation, partnership, and pragmatism, which most argue is not seen, especially in relation to the bigger donors. So that's, I think, one of the very good, strong aspects of Swedish aid, especially related to the other donors. One thing which surprised even us is, if you are aware of the international attempt to coordinate aid, one of the things that was mentioned again and again is reducing fragmentation of aid. So instead of channeling aid to small projects, do it in a large scale, and by doing that, you'd minimize transaction costs, you'd minimize administration costs, and so on. So this is repeatedly told in the international aid coordinating meetings that have been done in the world. But what we observe is, in fact, in the case of Ethiopia, fragmentation was increasing among all donors. In fact, over the years, in fact, donors were reducing the sort of the projects they ran. So fragmentation was increasing. And what we observe is, in fact, Swedish aid is the most fragmented of them all. Okay? So this is not, as usually said, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because fragmentation, even though it may increase administration and transaction costs, fragmentation could be also a good way of, experimenting on a small scale, yeah, finding a new, more productive way of allocating your aid. So because of this, it's not completely bad that fragmentation is increasing, as long as, let's say, it encourages experimentation, exploration, and because of that, it leads to a more effective way of allocating your aid. Now, let me go to the rural development cluster and give you a very small, more important highlights we found from our evaluation. Probably the two very prominent projects that come out from the rural development cluster is KADU, the Chilalo Agricultural Development Unit, and SARD. The KADU happened in the 1960s, starting in the 1960s, and SARD happened 1990s until 2010, around that. So these are the two big projects in that cluster. And both of them were very, very, very impactful. KADU had significant and lasting impact. In fact, even now, something like 60 years after the end of the project, when we talk about people who are working in the Chilalo area, they still tell you productivity, yield, and so on, even now is higher than the surrounding areas. And they are arguing that most likely this is because of the investment that was done during Kado's period. But not only that, a lot of the research, a lot of the extension programs that were designed by Kado became government programs. Now they are part and parcel of the Ministry of Agriculture. So the impact of Kado has got a very, very, very long reach. Some of the stories we heard, for example, like milk production is important in that area. And when we ask, when did this milk production start? It was introduced by Kado. So both in the area, as well as in terms of, providing useful forms of input to government activities, Kado's role cannot be underestimated. And in fact, we even go further than that. There is a lot of criticism on Kado, say, for example, because it has increased inequality. Yeah? It has enriched, in fact, the rich farmers, and it didn't support most of the poor farmers. This is one of the biggest criticisms that is leveled at Kado. But we feel even that criticism is misplaced, because Kado came into being at a certain historical juncture in Ethiopia. In fact, in terms of the evolution of the land tenure, that was probably one of the most important periods in Ethiopia, where capitalist relations of agriculture were developing fast, and private ownership of land was growing also very fast. Even the Haile Selassie government was giving land grants to individuals as properly titled land, which was very, very unusual for Ethiopian history. So it was a period when capitalist relations of production were penetrating agriculture. And because of that, during that period, inequality was increasing everywhere. It was not only in Kado area. Because of this long-term historical agrarian evolution. So essentially, in Kado, what people were criticizing were basically something which was happening also outside Kado area. It was part of a larger project. And nobody would expect one small project Kado to stop historical evolution. So even this criticism we feel is not, is a sort of misplaced criticism. In fact, some of the things the Kado staff were trying to do at that time were trying to sort of protect, let's say, tenants. One of the initiatives Kado was doing was basically writing a proper tenancy contract between farmers and landowners so that the landowners would not arbitrarily evict them. So in essence, Kado was, Kado was trying to establish a more legal system which protects, the tenants against the sort of the bad side of, capitalist transformation of agriculture. Okay? So somewhat, this may be a sort of, that's what I call a sort of a revisionist interpretation of Kado's experience. Third, that's also a highly innovative, decentralized, highly innovative rural development project. Particularly, it played an important role in showing that a budgeting process can be decentralized, at least in one region. Another important contribution of it introduced a low-cost registration certification of land, which was copied by other regions, and in fact it is loaded. If you are reading about registration and certification process in the international academic literature, this experience, Hardup's experience, is given as a sort of the best example. Okay, how much time do I have? All right. Okay. Okay. So let me give you also sort of a summary, a very short highlight of what happened in education. In education, probably the two major intervention of Swedish aid was with ESBU, this is the Ethiopian School Building Unit, which built a lot of schools in the 1960s, mainly in the 1960s, also it went on to the 1970s. And the impact of ESBU is extremely important because of two things. One, it was during a period where the number of schools in Ethiopia were very, very, very low. So it's significantly, in fact, some estimates say after ESBU finished most of the school building, if you count the number of schools in the country, something like 1/3 of them were related with ESBU's either renovation or building new schools. So it's a very, very significant stock of the number of schools in the 1970s was basically built by ESBU. Some estimates it has increased enrollment by 200,000. That is huge by that time because education was very, very much limited. Now, in addition to this, the other important impact is that most of the schools that were built by ESBU were built in remoter areas. They were not building schools in Addis Ababa. They were deliberately selecting remote areas where there aren't schools nearby. Which means for every school, socially, in fact, the social importance of that school is much more because it's not built in already in a region where people can access. So we have seen so many people telling us that let's say Warada, that region, saw schools for the first time because ESBU built those schools. Okay? So it increased significantly the stock of schools, but not only that, it spread these schools into marginal areas. So because of that, the social impact of that school building program cannot be underestimated. But in addition to that, the sort of the infrastructure they used, they were building schools with what do you call concrete blockade? Is it blockades? Yeah, blockades. And that was a new material, a new building material at that time. And many people were saying it is very expensive. You are investing a lot of money to build schools, and you have to use local materials. But I think in the long term, the fact that they used more expensive but more durable materials has significantly helped. Because when we for example, look at some research which show, let's say a school or a classroom may be built by ESBU in an old school. And when researchers now visit them after, let's say, 6 years, the old school has completely disappeared. But ESBU schools are standing. So in terms of the long term, even though they are costly when you build them, in terms of the long term, they could be even cheaper. So one of the distinctive features of ESBU schools is the fact that they are durable. And that's also an important contribution, especially because of the fact at that time in Ethiopia, maintenance of schools and so on is not an important issue. A lot of the schools that were built were dilapidated in a short period of time. So that also makes ESBU school building a very, very important program that has significantly contributed in the spread of education in Ethiopia. Sweden has also supported tertiary education, and the earlier support, particularly two institutions, the Building College and Gandet College of Forestry, are the two prominent institutions. Now, these are also extremely, if the history of spread of education in Ethiopia, tertiary education in Ethiopia is written, I'm sure these two colleges would play an important role. Why? Because both of them are specialized tertiary education institutions, which essentially filled a gap that was not there. Now, already at the time, both Building College and Gandet College of Forestry were set up, Addis Ababa University was already established. But these two colleges filled basically a gap that was not filled by Addis Ababa University. So there was no college of architecture, so the Building College filled that one. And Building College was built early in the 1960s. So because of that, it was almost the same time, maybe 5 or 6 years after the engineering faculty was established in Addis Ababa University. But the engineering faculty didn't have an architecture, so it filled that gap. Wondogendet College of Forestry, in fact, for a long time, not only at its establishment, for a long time, even probably now, it is the only higher education institution which specifically specializes in forestry. Okay? Now, the other aspect is, the Swedes know forests well, yeah? So it's not only filling, an educational gap in Ethiopia, but it is also a smart move from the Sweden side, because Sweden is also using its comparative advantage. Because Sweden knows about forestry, then it is using that comparative advantage. That's, in fact, one of the things we emphasize at the end of our report. Donors should also, focus on their own comparative advantage. Okay, so this is a very good illustration of that one. So obviously, there is a long-term and continuing support for Addis Ababa University by Sweden. Now, the third cluster is the cluster on democracy, human rights, and gender equality. So obviously, particularly gender equality was there even at earlier periods. So in most projects, gender equality was integrated. So gender equality was an important issue. But as I said, as a cluster, democracy and human rights and gender equality became more and more important probably from the end of the 1990s up to the current period. Now, we believe this cluster became important because of both demand and supply issues. On the one hand, if you look at rural development and education by the 1990s, Ethiopia was at a much better state compared to the 1960s. So by now, in fact, I think in many areas, probably enrollment rate is approaching, especially primary enrollment rate is approaching 100% or something like that, a very high percent. So by the 1990s and to the more recent period, so the Rural Development Extension Services, the Ministry of Agriculture is much stronger than it was in 1960s. So partly because rural development and education is at a better shape, the shift towards democracy, human rights, probably is driven by this sort of demand side issue. And particularly after 2018, when Abiy came to power, there was more relaxation. Especially there was a proclamation which was put by the EBA-rapporten regime in 2009, which significantly restricted the operation of civil society organizations. And in 2018, that was repealed, and that has spurred a lot of the emergence, expansion of a lot of NGOs, service CSOs. So it has spurred a lot of strengthening of that sector. So it is answering also partly Swedish focus on this sector is also partly driven by that demand side change. And in all the interviews you have done, participants of projects, government officials, NGOs, every one of them have told us that the condition has significantly improved after the repeal of this 2009 proclamation. So not only were there many NGOs that are operating, but also the sort of the trust between these NGOs and government officials also significantly improved. So government started to cooperate with NGOs. NGOs started to work with governments. And in fact, I remember one of the interview told us a certain ministry even wanted to finance their activities. But because they want to keep their independence, they refused to. So, but they told us this type of thing was unheard of before 2018, before the repeal of this proclamation. But obviously on the supply side also, not only Sweden, but most donors were also emphasizing the issue of democracy and human rights. And that shift also probably is the reason why we have a shift towards democracy, focus towards democracy, human rights, and gender. Okay. Sweden is involved in many different types of activities. Some of the recent activities Sweden is supporting CSOs, there are some CSOs which look at ethnic conflict avoidance, working with university students. There are some who are supporting vulnerable and hard-to-reach groups, very marginalized groups, like, for example, sex workers. Reforming the criminal justice system. Part of the Swedish support is operating through the United Nations organization and strengthening the Electoral and Human Rights Commission. So the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is also supported by Sweden, but also other donors. And we believe, even though now probably with the peace agreement, we hope that conflicts would be minimized or decreased. A thriving civil society institution is part of a healthy society. Now, particularly in a fragile type of political system, in a fragile type of country like Ethiopia, civil society can play an important role, even if, let's say, government institutions or other formal institutions cannot do their job. But we feel also we should be aware, when we focus on this type of aid, we should be aware there could be a trade-off between this and poverty reduction. He's telling me only 1 minute, so I have only 1 minute. So in conclusion, what we said was we have a lot of lessons learned. We have a lot of suggestions in the report. But finally, what we are arguing is the whole international aid architecture must be reshaped in such a way, at least, ideally, we should cooperate on everything, yeah? But at least the international aid architecture should be reformed in such a way, at least there is a consensus on international public goods. When we say international public goods, let's say this could be related with mitigation or reversal of climate change, yeah? Because this is something almost an existential threat. So there could be a possibility as an existential threat. There could be a possibility on that. Of course, supporting humanitarian crisis, to a certain extent, there is that kind of consensus. When there is a big disaster, then usually geopolitical things are left to the background and donors help to overcome those disasters. And hopefully, if this also expands to poverty reduction, then our idea is if we can build a global aid architecture, at least fully cooperating on these issues, irrespective of geopolitical concerns, yeah? That could be a huge improvement. And we believe on a very minor scale, the experience of Swedish aid to Ethiopia can give a lot of lessons to building that kind of international aid architecture. Because as we have seen, some of the characteristics we saw, like emphasizing partnership and conditionality, for example. Now, repeatedly, a lot of literature is coming up where conditionality is ineffective. It's not working. So I think Sweden has shown that probably partnership is a better way. Appreciating the historical and long-term structure, and a big dosage of pragmatism. And this is one of the characteristics we have seen in Swedish. So one of the sort of informal way where where people in Swedish aid are telling us is, even when conditions are bad, there could be a sort of a tailwind in some sectors where aid can work, where you can work with either NGOs or you can work with some departments in governments. So I think this type of, a bit more dosage of this type of pragmatism would help to build that global aid architecture. So we believe the experience of Sweden can also contribute a lesson to a new international aid architecture. Thank you very much. I have to stop here.
Thank you very much, Bereket. Very well structured presentation, which is like the book. That's one of the main advantages of the evaluation, that it has a very clear, succinct structure, easy to follow, and then good detailed analysis beyond that. So let's then go on to the panel discussion, and let me invite the members of the panel to come up here and sit. And Bereket, you're not allowed to sit there very long. Please join the others here. And we will also be joined by Åsa Andersson from the Swedish Embassy in Addis Ababa.
Thank you.
And while we wait for Åsa to join us, I would like to introduce the panel members. Well, you're here, Åsa. Nice to see you. Åsa Andersson is head of a bilateral development section in the Swedish Embassy in Addis Ababa, and she has worked with development cooperation in many capacities at strategic levels, but also with specific sectors, health issues, democratization, and many other things. So you are very welcome, Åsa, and we look forward to your comments on the report. Then, if I start from the door, from the wall, we have, saying on my right side or the left side, Fantu Cheru. You are very welcome. Fantu Cheru is Professor Emeritus from the American University in Washington, D.C., and he has also been working as Research Director of the Nordic Africa Institute and of CIPRI. And he is also editor of a recent Oxford handbook on the Ethiopian economy. He was also a member of the reference group here. You're very welcome, Fantu. Then we have Arne Bigsten, who is Professor Emeritus from the University of Gothenburg. And Arne has also been a member of the EBA committee for many years, so I'm very happy to see you back, Arne, in one capacity here, being a member of a panel. And then we have Stina Karltun, who has been working with human rights issues throughout her career in many different capacities, but for the last 19-20 years with SIDA, and also very importantly and interesting here, she was working with human rights issues, gender equity and democratization in Addis Ababa in between 2014 and 2016. So you are very welcome, all of you. And by the way, my name is Kim Fors, and I'm one of the members of the EBA committee. So we start this panel discussion with a short introduction by each of the four panel members, and then we will have a joint discussion after that. And by around 2:15, we open up for a general discussion, both and with questions from you who are here, but also from those who follow this presentation on the net. And I think you know how to post your questions so that they reach me and those who might answer. So why don't we start with the introduction from the person who is, I was going to say has traveling the longest, but she hasn't traveled at all. But anyway, Åsa, who is furthest away. You haven't been a member of a reference group. The others in the panel have been members of a reference group. So we have been having a discussion for the past four years about the report. But Åsa, you are of course the one of those who will take action on this report, and it would be interesting to hear what you take with you from it and what your comments on it are. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I hope you hear me now. I have a little bit of delay myself. Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you, Bereket and his team for a very interesting and I think very positive report. Well, it's probably not only me who can witness the achievements that development cooperation brought to this country for the past 60 plus years. I think in whatever meeting I attend, there will always be someone who mentions, for example, the schools that we have funded and built, as well as the Kadu project, as the Volganet forestry college, and I think most of the government representatives that are in the forestry sector have all been passing through that college. And so I think the impact that the Swedish Development Corporation has done in this country has been tremendous. I have, of course, looked at the report from where we are today in Ethiopia, also what we can do in order to learn and what we are bringing forward. I think it was really interesting, the finding around the overlapping goals, the trade between human rights-based approach and poverty reduction. And most of that is also what we have experienced over the past 1.5 years. As you know, the conflict has been ongoing, or maybe 2 years actually, before we just now got the cessation of hostilities agreement. And that is always a balance, and it's really around navigating a really tricky context, because from the political side, as well as from the development side, we have to continue to balance, which I think the authors have picked up on, and I think still I feel very positive about it, because we are, from the CEDA point of view, still relatively independent from how we act. I think also the thing which is a good assurance is about our leading role among donors, and I think despite of us being a middle donor when it comes to development cooperation, we are the 4th largest humanitarian donor in the country. So there are definitely a voice that we can continue to bring, and as my predecessors have always been very engaged in the donor partner groups, then the same is for me. I'm sitting in the executive committee and are very engaged in donor coordination within Ethiopia, as well as my colleagues in my team who are represented in various sector working groups for donor coordination. So that is something that is also get a good assurance from the report, and is something that we will continue to take on. I think also that the fact that we are a consultative and appreciated donor partner, if we just had consultations with our own partners, because we operationalize the new development strategy, and there we can see that they still feel that CEDA is a neutral, flexible donor. We are a long-term partner for Ethiopia. We're providing core support. We are allowing for adjustments in programs in a really quickly changing and unpredictable environment. And I think that is something well appreciated. We're also a strong advocate in all the areas that have been brought up, and in the areas where we still are engaging in the new country strategy, and that is environment, climate change, inclusive economic development, inclusive peaceful societies, human rights, democracy, gender equality, and international law and conflict perspectives. Finally, I'm thinking also about the recommendations around the fragmentation. And although it's good, and I feel that we are in line with the relevance and coherence that is still exists very much in our new strategy. However, I do believe that we can do better when it comes to being much more strategic in our support and try to reduce what has been already alluded to, very sort of smaller contributions that take a lot of time from us and high transaction costs. So there we still have a lot of things to do going forward. I know that we are trying to correct it ourselves with consortium approaches, trying to see where can we get larger support. We also have a restriction that we don't provide any direct support to the government. So of course the ones that are remaining are with the multilateral institutions, as well as with the civil society organization. Then you have to look at the absorption capacity. Already today we have about half of our portfolio going through the multilateral institutions. So it is still important to weigh the balance between those implementing partners, but also weighing the balance of having a catalytic support that is smaller, but can then provide good examples that other larger donors can follow. But that is something that I'm still taking with me. And then I also finally, I'm thinking about how the change of our support has been over the last couple of 60 years and where we are today. And although we had a large support in the agriculture sector, there are parts of it that we still are carrying with us in terms of our forestry sector support when it comes to climate smart agriculture. So there is still a very close connection with Vårlåget Forestry College still today. So there are things that we are still engaged in. But when it comes to, for example, the social sector support, there are donors here today who are having much more larger investments than we can provide in areas in health and education. Although we have a humanitarian crisis, as I'm sure all of you are aware of, and we know that that will be a focus, education will be a focus with our partners from the humanitarian envelope that is also coming into this country. I'm stopping there, so...
Thank you very much, Åsa. Thanks for those reflections, and I'm sure we'll get back to some of those issues in the discussion later on, not least the thing about fragmentation of aid and its consequences and potential benefits, but the harm it does as well. Maybe would you like to start, Fantu, with your comments to the report?
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to kind of congratulate Bereket and the team for having produced such a rich and informative report that document the historical journey of Swedish-Ethiopia relations over 60 years. I'm very much happy with the final product because many of my concerns I raised repeatedly in the reference group have been dealt with nicely. Particularly in the regard to questions of methodology, approach to the research. I think you've done a very good job on that front. I think the report is certainly very descriptive. I'm glad it is descriptive. I have no objection to that. But at the same time, the team has been able to pick up some of the enduring legacies of SIDA's finance project in Ethiopia. So you've been able to pick up what are the legacies, as you have indicated in your presentation. In short, this is the best history book on Ethiopia-Swedish relations, to tell you the truth. In fact, if I were asked to teach by the Embassy Ethiopia 101 course, which I've been doing with the US Embassy the last 5 years, this would be on top of the reading list, among the other reading list. I think you've done a very good job. Some people may raise questions about that the report is too positive in its overall assessment. That might be true, yes, but one has to understand this is merely a presentation of the historical journey of the Swedish cooperation through the lens of this project. That means, because my initial disagreement was the reference to the OECD DAC evaluation criteria. But here you have cleverly adopted them without having to deal with that hardcore reference. I think it's a brilliant work that they have done. I think this is not a normal project evaluation in the sense of project evaluation as such, trying to measure impact based on strict evaluation criteria. So strict application of the OECD criteria would have distorted the value of this historical analysis, particularly viewed from the vantage point of 3 regime types with different ideological orientation. The imperial period, the socialist period, and then the post-1991 EPRDF period. So in a sense, you have used these terms of coherence, effectiveness liberally, because they are very much indicative of the journal outcome. One should therefore read the report accordingly. This is particularly a problem. I think the older projects were initiated during the period of feudal rule. They were brought to a close the end of the socialist period. it was impossible for you to collect data on yield data, and enrollment data would have been very difficult because of, and of course, the second option would have been to take ethnographic study. That was not possible because of COVID. So in a sense, because of this, given these challenges, you opted out for a more nuanced, more pragmatic, more eclectic, and iterative approach to approach this. So in that sense, I'm very, very happy the way that, because I was initially concerned, but I think you have done a very good job. Let me come back to what I call the mother of all projects. That is CADU. There are about 75 PhD theses written on CADU. 75 PhD theses written. So there is no way, each of taking different angle, but I think you have done very well descriptively what was going on, why and the how. That was a very important. I want to leave with that. However, maybe because I'm increasingly being Swedishized, my focus has, I want to bring in something that was missed. It is there, but that was not highly emphasized. CADU was not simply a project on agricultural modernization. It was more than that, if you look into the details the way you described it. So there you begin to see snippet of aspect of Swedish culture, Swedish value, I mean. It comes into that process in the operations of the CADU. From being Swedish dominated in the initial years, CADU quickly became more diverse, both in terms of personnel, but also in terms of about ideas about development. So in that sense, the increasing recruitment of Ethiopian experts into CADU, so it was not the Ferengis, the Europeans, arriving in Africa and trying to teach the natives. The situation in CADU was very different. It played out in a very different way. It became a center of mutual learning and experimentation, a place for cross-fertilization of ideas between Swedes and Ethiopians. Both parties were learning from each other rather than donor imposing its preconceived ideas. This was particularly became much more clearer after the 1975 revolution. Most of the Ethiopian experts was my generation, radicals, university students who want land to the tiller. And here are Swedes who started a project under an imperial rule. So they were educating the Swedes, but the Swedes were also much more open to understand the context of the reality, what was going on post-1975 revolution in Ethiopia. So it was a revolution. So I think this culture of listening you talked about, the ability to dialogue, again, very consistent in Swedish value, played an important role in facilitating both parties from moving forward. Let me just add one more statement on this. I think talking about values. In the report, you talk about Sweden was very much accepted because it doesn't have strategic political interest like the United States and others. I think it's more than that. I would say that more than the volume of aid given to Ethiopia by Sweden, trust is the most important currency that Sweden has, more than the money. So that's the question what other donors are listening. So the question of this trust is, of course, where does this trust come from? This trust is basically a product of the fundamental Swedish values: solidarity, equality, a commitment to democracy and human rights. So I think the value element play an important role. It's described, but you don't call it a value. Of course, Swedes don't like to brag, but so be it. This is a bragging right. It should be there. It should have been emphasized. So I think this aspect could have been more clearly brought about in the report to demonstrate the social democratic values that undergird the Swedish society in this relationship, which is very much warmly embraced by the Ethiopians. And finally, on the fragmentation issue, I'll go very quickly because we have no time. Because you can't work with the government, okay? That was the decision that came out in the 1990s. But in the meantime, there was a lot of local initiative going on there but nobody was supporting them. Sweden was the one that took the risk to support this initiative. When they succeeded, what happened? Other donors followed. So there's a reason why things will become fragmentation, because the inability, because the roads were closed in terms of engaging the state. So, but it is still, in the meantime, I caution, it's easy to say that we don't work directly with the government. Not in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the state is everywhere. It is in the bedroom. It is in the kitchen. Okay? So let's not say that we need to understand. So the state is hovering over you like a helicopter parent, and one must understand that reality. And finally, on your conclusions, on about the future. Here the report is extremely, it's very optimistic. And takes the spoken words of the Prime Minister for granted. Ethiopia is actually in turmoil right now. So let's not, I say, hold your horses, not so quick. I don't share this optimism very much. The country is very much engulfed right now. It's a serious crisis, particularly this week. So it will take many years to get rid of ethnic politics. The country is extremely divided ethnically. So I would urge SIDA and the Swedish government to take a cautious approach as this continues to engage in Ethiopia. I'll stop right here. Sorry I took time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, time very well used to also to remind us of important issues like trust and values and many other things that you mentioned. I'm sure we will get back to those also. Arne, would you like to share your thoughts?
All right. Yes, I agree with the previous authors, previous speakers. That it's a well-written, interesting, and useful report. It deals with a very challenging issue, trying to explain the impact of SIDA or Swedish aid over 60 years. And it's a big challenge to do. Coming from economics, you always try to think about counterfactuals, so what would happen if we had not been there, etc. And this is not possible to do here in a very thorough way, and Bereket describes what they do. One of the themes that I'm interested in and what is asked in the terms of reference is what happens with regard to poverty due to what we've done here. This is something you really can't say, that the impact of aid on poverty is that. You can back a bit down and say, okay, what is the impact of what you've done in the rural development, education, on growth, which is important for them, poverty reduction? There's not much of that either. So you back down one step further to see what's happening in terms of the infrastructure you put in place, the schools you build, etc. And that is quite useful. And the 2 chapters on rural development and education, I think, convince me, in spite of my methodological hang-ups, that something is established, done here, which is very useful and which is also good for growth and then probably also for poverty reduction. So you have to back down and be a bit cautious as to how much you can say on the basis of this. But I think rural development was quite a successful endeavor, generated a lot of infrastructure, and also the education investment generated a lot of infrastructure, which is important. And I think looking at the whole literature of development and also the evidence here, these are the kind of things that's important for growth in the future. And if you're going to have sustainable development or sustainable poverty reduction, there has to be growth, economic growth. Otherwise, it won't happen because you can't redistribute something you don't have. So that's one of the key things. And it would have been interesting, I think, to have a bit more discussion about the growth implications of these investments in infrastructure in the case of Ethiopia. Because, as I said, this is where you can sustain development in the long term. You had the rural development. I have one thing I think about the rural development, the comprehensive rural development schemes. We've left them, it seems, and moved over to education and social infrastructure. And I think that's fine. But that's an interesting question as such. Why don't we have comprehensive rural development schemes anymore, while it seemed to work in the good old days? That's would be interesting to know. But the fact that you back down to education and focus on that, I think is also quite okay, because investment in human capital, be it education or health, is key for development. So I think education, if you don't know what to do, spend money on education. That's a pretty safe bet. So these infrastructure events or developments, they are key. When it comes to the whole discussion about democracy, what we can do, this is much more tricky. I think we can help support institutions which are relevant. But from the outside, I don't think we can change attitudes or the way people do things. That has to come from below, from within. So I don't think we can build democracy from the outside. We can help a bit, check the elections or something like that. But that's a much harder thing to do. And also the evidence here is more vague, if you like. So I think the two first infrastructure chapters, if you like, provide evidence that this is pretty good aid that's been done. But of course, again, we don't have any cost to relate to the benefits. So if you throw in billions of money, of course something comes out, and we don't have any cost-benefit ratios here. So we don't know for sure. But reading those two chapters, I'm sort of convinced that it was money well spent and value for money. What about the future? What do we do? Well, one of the things we talk about here, you talk in the report, is about partnerships, that you are staying there, whatever happens. And that is not always maybe good. You did, or we did, hang in with the derg longer than anybody else. We tend not to drop out, and like we did in Tanzania in the bad old days in late 1970s, etc. So if you believe in this tailwind story that they also tell, that we should go in where we have somebody doing something which is useful, we think, maybe you should also withdraw when they don't continue to do the things that you would like to do. So it's a bit tricky there, how far you should go, stay with your partners, and when you should go back. So that can be debated. And the discussion in the last section on where we should go from here is really about ways of going around the government, like going for global public goods, for example, which is a good thing. But still, we need to be there in some sense as well. And maybe you can think of also other things, apart from what the stuff that you describe, like support private sector investment in Ethiopia, or invest in development banks, or something like that. I'm not sure if you can avoid the government, after all, as you say, but exactly where we should jump with that will depend on what's happening now on the ground, of course. But growth should be steering what you do. You should try to do investments in infrastructure that supports the future development, long-term growth. And if you read Stefan Durkon's book, which I've read quite carefully lately, Ethiopia is one of the cases where they explain success in development is due to some kind of agreement in the elite that we go for long-term growth. And this could have been discussed a bit more here as well. Why did Ethiopia succeed to have fast growth for a couple of decades, while other places like DRC, with the same kind of development papers, failed completely? Ethiopia had done pretty well here. That, I think, would be an interesting thing to think about. And did what we do there, or did there, contribute in some sense to this? I don't know. But that's one of the main outcomes, I think, in Ethiopian development, is that they managed to go from complete stagnation to fast growth for a long time. And that's also what's going to help with poverty reduction in the future.
Thank you, Arne. We have, of course, had many, so to say, methodological discussions in the expert committee on the virtues of doing studies over a 60-year period, etc., and many other methodological discussions as well. But I don't think I often hear you say that you tend to agree, or that you don't have major objections. So, Bereket, I must congratulate you to having sort of convinced Arne here around the virtues of a report. You're very, very good. Thank you. Stina, let's... Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will focus on one specific point, the trade-off between poverty reduction and human rights, as it is put in one of the takeaways from the whole report. Is that true, really? And I would have liked to see in the report some kind of discussion on this. What do you really mean by it? Is it the decision after the elections in 2005 that prompts you to say that, or what is it? Our government decided to disengage with direct cooperation with the government of Ethiopia after those elections. And while I was in Ethiopia, there were little money to spend on what was originally thought to complement the big sector support or public financial budget support, simply. So I think you have to see this. Okay, you can't hear me well. Okay, sorry. So I think you have to see this in a little bit of historic, in a historic view of development cooperation, like in 1960s decolonization, development cooperation being about putting the new nations on track to be members, full-fledged members of the community of nations in the world, and then with all the history that passed and more and more institution building and institutions and governments becoming somewhat richer and taking part internationally and having their own ideas about how to develop their countries, and the importance of ownership and the Paris Agreement and the budget support and all of that, and then the feel that in specifically in authoritarian states, the need to have a counterpart to government in the society in order to have social accountability, a fresh view on things, some voices, some areas where voices of the people could emerge and not only be government. So you could say what remained was this little thing for us to work with. And I would insist that it has been a very effective type of poverty alleviation. So I don't see that trade-off that you were talking about in the things that we did. But of course, there could have been much more. Could we have had big projects with the government? On the other hand, Sweden is giving about a third, I think, to big multilateral organizations of its development support, another third to the EU and its cooperation. Both of these areas has a lot of government to government, not the least in Ethiopia. I mean, those are super large actors in the development cooperation in Ethiopia, and Sweden has quite a large part of that. We are contributing. Now, the little thing that we've been working with from the embassy is sort of a complement, you could say, to that. And I just want to mention one example of visiting one of these community-based organizations outside Adama or Birzeit, who was a funeral society, who was ringing a bell when someone was dead and there was a need to collect money in the environment in order to support the family and so on for the funeral rites and everything that had to do with it. When I was visiting, this little CBO was having an emergency housing scheme for people who were homeless, running a school of 500 plus pupils, and no one of these children was allowed to not make it. They had a bank account and they had money there, so there was no need to ring bells for collection of money, but of course to notify that there was a death and what was going to happen. And they had a very good loudspeaker system for this. It was so good that the Kebede was hiring it for its own governmental campaigns to succeed. And when talking with the people there, I mean, there was much more, but I stop here. When talking with the people there, they said, what was the trick? How did they come to this point? Yes, because they had gone through capacity building. They had experienced a lot of work with different things, for instance, with orphans and vulnerable children, taking care of them, etc., etc. So they had know-how now. They knew how to organize, how to save, how to do a lot of different things. And there are quite a few of these type of CBOs. And some of them, they don't need any support from outside for what they want to do because they are already in quote-unquote rich enough. But I mean, it's just one little example. Time doesn't permit to take many of them, but I just want to insist that there is, in that sense, that it's hard to find a trade-off between human rights and poverty elevation, because this is about human rights. This is about human dignity to act, about the right to organize locally. I mean, it was limited, but they were allowed to do it. About gender equality, they were campaigning against violence of women, etc., and early marriages and all of that, and etc., etc., point after point. So I just want to say that I think you should have elaborated on this when you make this point in order to make it understood. And as it stands now, I do disagree with it. Thank you.
It's allowed to disagree, that's fine. You will also have the opportunity to disagree, of course, and we should move into the question and answer session relatively quickly now. Just before that, Bereket, would you want to say something very briefly about one of the other points? Of course, when you disagree with Stina, but apart from that,
we are friends.
yes, but
yeah. A lot of issues have been raised. Probably simply randomly, can I respond to some of them? I think Fantu's comment that we are optimistic is correct. The conclusion is we took a more optimistic view, because we know when a country is in a sort of a verge of conflict, two things can happen. It can stabilize quickly, but it can also fall into complete chaos. So in a sense, we are more inclined to the optimistic interpretation. Probably that optimistic interpretation is now reinforced because of the peace agreement. In fact, when we wrote this report, still the peace agreement was not signed. So I think the peace agreement probably would tilt it towards the optimistic view. But definitely it's optimistic. But you can have also a very pessimistic kind of scenario.
Cessation of hostilities, not peace agreement. The peace agreement is a huge mountain to climb yet. A lot of political. It's a cessation of hostilities, but not a peace agreement yet. So the road ahead, it can work out nicely, or it may break down. But anyway, a good report, you should end it also with a good note.
No, by the way, the report was written before the peace agreement, so you cannot include that. But the interpretation of the peace agreement is also, you can have an optimistic or pessimistic view. But from what so far is happening, at least the main guns are silent in Tigray.
For the north,
So that's a huge step. I think some of the news we hear is there is also an actual disarmament.
Yes.
And because of that, now the problem, probably the conflict, the major scene of conflict may have moved to another region, but at least what we see from what's happening so far is at least the big guns are silent in the Tigray region. So I think that is an optimistic outcome.
Should we perhaps let in the audience and maybe if there's something else?
Probably that's better, otherwise we would
okay, we have 2 questions. Please, would you just say who you are before you ask the questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Robel Zamikael, and I'm not Ethiopian, I'm a Tigrayan. First of all, I would like to say that I'm trying to be professional right now, because what I'm feeling right now, words cannot express. And I see you congratulating each other. First of all, it's not a conflict. It is a genocide, what is happening in Tigray. Over 500,000 people died. They've been executed, shot to death. Over 500,000. 120,000 women of Tigray, girls of Tigray, aging from 4 to 81, have been raped. I want you to know. Age of 4. It could have been your daughter. It could have been your mother. Know that. I see you congratulating each other. That's so shameful. Shameful. Major infrastructures have been destroyed by the government. Schools have been destroyed. There was nothing. There was nothing for the people of Tigray. They have been killed. They have been rotten to death. There was no medicine. They were closed for 2 years. I'm trying to breathe, I'm sorry. They've been closed for over 2 years. It is not a peace treatment. The Eritrean soldiers are still there. They're still killing our people. Eritrean soldiers are still there. They are inside of Aksum. They're doing a lot of propagandas against our people. They're trying to kill our people again. My question to you is, you said Abiy Ahmed, after the reign of Abiy Ahmed, there was a lot of change, right? What about the ethnic discrimination that happened before the war? Tigrayans have been called cancers. I can show you the videos. He called Tigrayans cancers. Daytime hyenas. I'm sorry. Daytime hyenas. He chose a method to ethnically discriminate Tigrayans so that they can be out of the society. There is an ongoing genocide still right now. An ongoing genocide. What do you say about that? And Sida, you say you're trying to find a way for the democracy and human rights? Are our people going to get justice? 600,000 of them? Those are the ones who died. What about our girls, our women? 120,000 of them. Those of that we know, those that have reported. There are a lot. Canadian Parliament has done a study. United Kingdom has done a study. Irish has done a study. Australian Parliament has done a study. They've said, I'm sorry, I need to talk. I need to let it out. They have done a study and then they said it's a genocide that is happening. What about our people? What about Oromian people? They have been decapitated. What about them? Ethiopia has failed as a state. I'm sorry, I need to say it, please. Just give me one more minute, please. Sorry, you have to post your questions. One more minute. And we need other people to post their questions as well. Okay, one more minute, just one more minute.
Perhaps you take that afterwards.
Jag heter Johan Holmberg. Jag jobbade i Etiopien. Oh, sorry. Speak English. Sorry. Sorry about this. I'm still Johan Holmberg, though. And I worked with the rural development programs in Ethiopia from 1971 to 1976. So I started with the CADO in 1971. And I have some comments on the treatment of these programs in the report. of course, I got the report when I entered the room, so I haven't read it.
Quick reading.
But let me say a few things. The conclusions I agree with, Professor Kebede's conclusions, I think they're correct. But I think the report does not give justice to the role of the Swedish Agricultural University in launching the package programs we're talking now about the mid-1960s, because the intellectual input came from the Agricultural University in Uppsala. And the report, there's a dissertation written about this, which you have included in your literature list, which you could have given more justice to. My second comment is that the main result of CADU was not SARDEP. The main result of CADU was the Extension and Project Implementation Department in the Ministry of Agriculture. And the World Bank loan, the Minimum Package Program, that distributed the findings from CADU all over Ethiopia, including Tigray, including Eritrea at the time. And that was the main result of CADU, I would argue. And you don't mention that at all in the report. Now, finally, I don't know how you discuss the impact that the revolution had on the rural development programs, because that impact, of course, was significant and beyond the control, obviously, of Sweden or any of the Ethiopian professionals who were working with this. But it did impact on the results in the long term. The final comment I have is that the report doesn't seem to cover the research cooperation at Addis Ababa University. Maybe this was not covered in your terms of reference. But I very much agree with the comment made that the long-term effects of building a knowledge base in the recipient country, that's the best activity you can do. That has long-term results, lasting results, and the research cooperation with Ethiopia has been very successful, I've known from other contexts. Thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, do we have any questions from those who are present? No? Bereket, would you like to respond to?
So many points are raised. So I'm sure I'm not going to deal with all of them. I did start with the optimism. I think the comment I have already given in that respect is sufficient. The issues Arne raised, particularly in terms of identifying properly, like an impact evaluation project, identifying properly the outcome from the rural development project, the outcome from the educational. As he already mentioned, it's extremely difficult because of the lack of data. So initially, in fact, when we planned this evaluation, we were hoping at least we would get some fundamental information on enrollment rates, on yield data, and we thought that could help us to understand the short-term and the long-term impact of those projects. But that data was not available. So essentially, when you work on impact evaluation, where a lot of uncertainty exists, you don't know what's happening, essentially you have to opt to a different type of evaluation methodology. So the sort of the standard gold standard impact evaluation methods would not work in this instance because the data is not available. It's a very long period of time. It is passing through a lot of historical. So that's why we opted for a historical and long-term view of the different issues. Stina, the trade-off, I think we will still continue our debate. I'm not convinced. The main point in our project is, even if you look at it from the general point of view, economists say there is no free lunch. When you do something, you are using your energy, time, and resources to do that thing. So you are always doing that thing at the expense of something else. There is always an opportunity cost. So think about, for example, the biggest poverty reduction that has happened in human history. That basically happened in China.
Without any cooperation with the government.
Yeah, I agree with that. But
or what?
Let me finish. Don't interrupt me. So the biggest poverty reduction in the world happened in China. Something like 500 million people were pulled out of poverty. And if you look at from the Western point of view, from the Western understanding of democracy and so on, this is without any democracy. In fact, you can argue even in a highly dictatorial authoritarian system. Now, one point we have to take into account is, shouldn't anyone, whether you are a strong supporter of democracy or not, as long as you are interested in poverty reduction, shouldn't you appreciate that type of? So on the general level, there could be significant improvements in the standard of living of people, even in an authoritarian situation. The best example is, for example, China. Okay, so take that into account, so just as a general. Now, when we come to Ethiopia, what we observed is, if you look at what happened after 2005, so because of the Ethiopian-Eritrean war and the 2005 controversial election, essentially Swedish support was withdrawn. Now, whether it is by coincidence or by design, if you look at poverty rates between 2005 and after 2005, in fact, the biggest poverty reduction in Ethiopian history happened also during that period, when you know, the support was withdrawn. So we are not saying exactly, we are not claiming that there is a causality between the two. But what we are questioning is, would Sweden have played a more important role in that poverty reduction? Yeah? If poverty reduction is one objective, and if it is the most important, poverty reduction is the most important objective, then basically Sweden have lost a very good opportunity. It could have contributed during that period. We have to think in terms of, so whenever you do something, as I have said, I'm an economist, and economists say there is no free lunch. When you do something, you are moving your resources, your energy and time to something, and you will not do other things. So if the most important thing is poverty reduction, then there was in fact a trade-off. We should ask that, could Sweden have played a more important role in that poverty reduction during that period? I don't remember your name, Roberto or? No, my name is Robel. Robel, okay. Yeah, Robel, okay. Yeah, you have raised a lot of issues, and I understand. I sympathize. Okay, facts. Okay, facts. Yeah. You have said what you want to say. Let me respond at least to what you said. So I sympathize with a lot of the things you have said, and I think everybody recognizes that there were violations of human rights on both sides. This is almost the nature of conflict. It's usually very difficult to say that one side of a conflict is their hands are clean. So usually I understand some of the things you have said. But I also understand that the TPLF and the government have come into an agreement. And I think for any peace-loving member of humanity, I think this is a good progress. Yeah, those are different issues, but the fact that the guns are silent by itself is I believe it's one good thing. Then if things, as the pessimistic, as some pessimists say, things may go bad. Yeah, we may go to the worst situation. If we go there, yeah, we would be very unhappy. But at least this is a first step to stop conflict. That's stopping the guns. Is, I think, a very good thing that we should appreciate. The question about CADU, I fully agree. Especially you are one of the, the initial participants of the CADU project. By the way, I didn't say that SARDP is the main result of CADU. No, the two are not related with each other. SARDP came late 1990s. CADU was finished by the early 1970s. What I said was, two of the big rural development-related projects supported by Sweden are CADU and SARDP. But I'm not saying that the most important result of CADU is SARDP. Because as I have said, the most important result of CADU is that it has significantly improved yield, productivity, and so on. But apart from that, it has also fed into the government agricultural system a lot of experience. In fact, the government expanded its extension project after taking the experience of CADU. So as you said, those are the most important legalities of CADU.
Thank you. Well, that gives you the last word here, because
the last one?
yeah, yes, I mean we have to finish on time because it's being filmed, and hence we are 5 minutes over, which we seldom are. We always finish sharp, but a little bit longer today. So thank you very much for attending this seminar, and before we leave, I'd like to remind you and also welcome you to the last seminar that EBA has for this year. And that is a joint activity between SIDA and EBA and the Swedish Red Cross. And it's the flagship report of ALNAP, which is the state of the humanitarian system. And the date for that is the 19th of December at 2:30. Close by, Medelhavsmuseet, not Medeltidsmuseet. So you're welcome to attend that as well. And thank you very much for attending today. And go home and read the report. Thanks.